Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at our monthly speaker series event. This time we are pleased to have Yadgar Merani, the CEO and founder of Lezzoo, along with Zaab Sethna, who is a founding partner of Northern Gulf Partners. Every month some of you have joined us. This might be some of your first time attending these events, but every month at 51 Invest, which is an initiative of 51 Labs, we are pleased to bring you interesting and exciting people in the investment landscape around Iraq and talk about different topics. So we have covered angel investing, venture capital. We have talked about individual deals that have been done in Iraq. And our goal each month is to once again highlight interesting people and provide some education around this area of investments. So we have two great panelists today. As 51 Labs and 51 Invest, our overall goal is to increase the amount of investment and facilitate increased investment in Iraq. And so it's exciting to hear from people who are doing it. And you'll hear more from Yad and Zaab quickly. Hopefully, you know Yad and use his app. You might know less about Zaab, but he is an interesting actor in the Iraqi investment scene. And so it's our pleasure to introduce him as well to those of you who might not be familiar with him. So enough from me. I will turn over to each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly. We'll start with Yad. I know each of you has a long and interesting story. Yad will probably focus more on your time at Lezzoo, and I know we were chatting right before the event and about some of the developments both at the company and in the ecosystem of Iraq over the past couple of years. So maybe we can introduce you that way and focus on sort of what's been going on recently.
Thank you very much, Pat. It's great to be here again. And thanks everyone for attending this event. So yeah, I'm Yadgar, the CEO and co-founder of Lezzoo. Lezzoo is an on-demand delivery super app that delivers food, groceries, pharmaceuticals, your online cards, your credit for your cellular, getting your COVID test, getting something to pick up from one place to another, having a booking service that you want to have reserved through Lezzoo. Essentially, it's a super app for your reservations, for deliveries, and so on. My role mainly in Lezzoo is, I would say, product strategy and marketing and growth management and the investment management within Lezzoo. And finally, of course, I'm responsible for making sure that our team is well coached and is mentored as we are going forward with the local team we have developed in Iraq and Kurdistan, and as we expand throughout the market. Lezzoo was the first Iraqi Kurdish startup that was accepted by Y Combinator, and we were one of the first Iraqi startup to receive investment from Y Combinator and international investors. Also, Lezzoo was the first Iraqi Kurdish startup to raise the largest seed round of investment. Since launch until now, I can happily say that in our first year, we anticipated almost 800% growth. Just to give you some background on how did we manage to get into YC and how did we manage to get investment. On our second year, we had 400% growth, and this is in compound, so that's year over year. And finally, on our third year, we had 150% growth, and that's in revenue, of course. Currently, our network of merchants has reached almost 1,000 across Iraq. We started in Erbil, but now we're in Erbil, Duhok, Baghdad, and Suli, and soon to be launching all across Iraq. We started with a team of only 3 co-founders, and today we're a team of almost 380 members. And Lezzoo is just continuously growing and keep leading forwards and maintaining its market leader status as it continues.
Thanks. That's a great introduction. I realize I did not do a great job of introducing Zaab and why he is here. He is one of your investors. So I would like for him to not only highlight Northern Gulf Partners, which is an institution many might not be familiar with, but also his role in the initial investment. Zaab, thanks for being here.
Hi, Pat. Thank you very much. Hi, Edgar. I'm a founder and partner in Northern Gulf Partners. As you said, it's an investment firm. It's actually a US registered firm that's active in Iraq as a financial investment firm. And what we do is a couple of things. We do direct investments, so where we invest directly into Iraqi companies or projects. And we also do advisory, where we advise Iraqi companies on general corporate finance matters, strategic M&A, or we advise foreign investors looking at an Iraqi investment, looking to enter the Iraqi market. Or for a while, we had a number of assignments of foreign investors looking to exit the Iraqi market. But I'm happy to say that tide has turned, and it's now the other way again, which I hope is a sign that Iraq has passed through some of its more troubled recent history and has turned a corner, so to speak, in terms of the economy and the political situation. And so what we are not is a VC. So let me be clear about that. But we have quite long experience in Iraq. We've been working in Iraq for, I think, 12 years. Our work started primarily in the oil and gas sector. As everybody knows, that's the driver still of the Iraqi economy. And there's a very large oil and gas development program going on both in southern Iraq and in Kurdistan. And the oil and gas investment in southern Iraq in the last 10, 12 years has been extremely large. And it's been driving the economy in the entire country. And so we saw, as an investment group, we saw a number of opportunities feeding into and taking advantage of that oil and gas and infrastructure spend. But our focus has changed from oil and gas, and I think it's obvious why the oil and gas era of the world is slowly receding, even if it's still the major factor in the Iraqi economy. But it's slowly changing, or it's quickly changing in many parts of the world, but slowly changing in Iraq. But also what we see, it's also a function of what we see in Iraq. As the country, as people in the country gain more disposable income, as the per capita GDP increases, and it's tripled in the last 12 years in Iraq. Many people outside Iraq don't realize that. But as the middle class grows, as people get more disposable income, there are a number of things that they spend on, and that's been shown in emerging markets all over the world. So it's nothing new in Iraq. People spend on education, on healthcare, on consumer products, on financial services. And so from an investment standpoint, that's how we're now looking at Iraq. Much less extractive industries, natural resources, and much more the growing middle class and the growing group of consumers, especially the younger consumers. I can repeat, but most people already know that Iraq has Iraq's demography skews young, right? So there's a youth bulge on its way, and that. So when you look at that from an investment standpoint, you see that young people are connected. They spend on data, and they use their phones now increasingly to order things, or to play games, or to take part in the digital economy. And so we're seeing that, and our investment in Lezzoo was one of our first steps to kind of be involved in that sector of the Iraqi economy. And we'll be happy to talk about Lezzoo as this conversation goes on.
That's great. Thank you. Yes, we'll get more into the details of that, and really excited about those. You know, we are as an institution really excited about those trends as well that you've highlighted, and excited that people are recognizing them and supporting them to help companies like Lezzoo grow with financing. I should mention here that we will certainly have questions and a question and answer session at the end of this. So if people have questions, they can put it in the chat and we will get to it a little bit later. In the meantime, Yad, you mentioned that Lezzoo went through Y Combinator. A lot of people might not be familiar with Y Combinator. I was wondering if you could explain that program very briefly, and then probably in a little bit more detail, explain sort of how that leads to financing and how that led to your first, as you mentioned, largest seed round at the time for an Iraqi company.
Thanks, Pat. So Y Combinator is one of the leading accelerators in the world. It's also known for as the Harvard of accelerators. We have seed starters, you have 500 startups, and you have, I think Takween now in Iraq is an accelerator. So you have a few accelerators around the world, but Y Combinator is it's sort of the main leader in the accelerator landscape. Y Combinator is also the same accelerator that invested in Coinbase, Instacart, DoorDash, Firebase, Codecademy, for those of you, the technical folks to know, Segment, Mixpanel, Dropbox, Airbnb. These are the top 10, let's say, the $10 billion with the IPO'd portfolios of Y Combinator. And also they've invested in markets in India, in Middle East, being mainly Cairo, the UAE, and Iraq, believe it or not. These three countries are the main countries in the Middle East that Y Combinator has invested in as their Middle East investments. Also is founded by Paul Graham and his wife, and Paul Graham was one of the early members of Yahoo, who then him and his wife both co-founded Y Combinator, and Y Combinator itself was a startup. So the reason I'm giving this context is because to explain to you how the program works, I'll have to explain the context of how Y Combinator started and what kind of principles and values are used for their startups and those who join the program. Given that Y Combinator was a startup and having some background in venture capitalism, they realized that the process for getting funds and having founders connecting with investors was a sort of a complicated process. Therefore, they decided to create their own accelerator program where they helped founders connect with investors by helping them create their pitch decks, to know exactly what product they're working on, how to do their market sizing. And I mean, I think those of you who have been in talks in 5-1 Labs and in Takween and maybe Orange Corners and a few other platforms that now exist in Iraq, you've probably heard all these terms, and the training that you've received and the workshops that you've received are basically, we can say, somehow derivatives of what the Silicon Valley folks created, and mainly Y Combinator being the leader in this field. One thing that we got throughout our experience was, of course, being the first Iraqi startup in Y Combinator was somehow odd even for the Y Combinator portfolio itself. That when we were presenting or we were introducing ourselves to other startups, and they would double check or triple check, or sorry, exactly, where Iraq? Are you sure you're talking about Iraq? Because let me just be certain if Iraq is you're referring to. It's and they would. Paul Graham himself told us, do you even have internet? Like, do you have an internet infrastructure in Iraq? And how is that? How did you manage to pick this up? How did you manage to pick up this product? Is there even demand? So Iraq is very disconnected, and to not only the international world, even in the Middle East, you can say Iraq is quite isolated. So it's understandable that, you know, there isn't much familiarity and insight on what exactly is going on in the market here. So I guess this is one of the main points where YC was just curious to know, okay, now there's a product in Iraq that has promising traction, and they have a vision, and they're trying to achieve this, which is building a digital infrastructure and contributing to the digital infrastructure, which is why we got into the program. Now, you may think that there is a playbook in YC where they're like, listen, this is exactly what you have to be doing. Not necessarily. First thing, you have to read all the essays of Paul Graham, which if you go on paulgraham.com, you will find all the lists. I think, Pat, you've read a few of them before. Paul Graham essays are basically essays he's been writing ever since 2006 until now, and these essays cover up all sorts of topics, from, you know, recruitment, from founder mentality, from being independent, from speaking to investors, how to evaluate your company. So when you join the program, everyone already expects that you have read all the essays of Paul Graham, because Paul Graham is PG, and he's the one who is basically the leader within Y Combinator. And he, based on his experience with all the thousands of startups he's had, he sort of gives his insight of what he has learned, and kind of advises founders and startups to follow the same footsteps. At the same time, they connect you with other founders who have other challenges that they face on day-to-day basis, and make sure that you're discussing on these points, as well as keeping in mind of what Paul Graham has raised on his experience with Airbnb and Dropbox and Stripe and all these different, you know, massive companies. We're talking about $50 billion plus valuations. Then sort of like everyone refers to those terms and make sure that you come to some kind of solution. The main thing that they do kind of and do facilitate a lot is the fundraising part. So YC does help you a lot in terms of making sure that your entity is set up, so you do receive investment. You're an investable company. They facilitate a lot in that context. And providing you with the financing know-how, so how to fundraise, how to evaluate the company, how to think of evaluation, what kind of instruments to use in financing, and how to present your startup, and how to basically make sure that you as a founder are in control of your product as you go forward. These kind of you can say that this know-how and playbook is provided by YC, and it's one of the main points where I think startups in YC stand out compared to other, let's say, accelerators. I'll give you a quick, let's say, fact on this point. May be interesting, that YC was the accelerator that came up with an alternative to convertible notes. And convertible notes are basically previously were as a debt instrument or a financing instrument, where an investor will loan you money with a specific interest rate and a maturity date, which means that with a specific period of time or time frame, you'll have to eventually pay back. But during this time, there will be an interest on how much you'll be charged. YC, and before that, you had equity as well, where you would directly sell equity to the investor, which requires a lot of due diligence and a lot of legal work, and it can be expensive and time consuming. So one thing that YC realized is that good products not only are faced with capital shortages, but also time has to be on the startup side or the founder's side. Time is really important. A lot of startups failed not because they didn't have a good idea or good product, simply because they delayed their launch, or they were late in launching their product. So time is really important. Therefore, they came up with this alternative financing instrument known as a SAFE agreement, or a SAFE. A SAFE is called a simple agreement for future equity. What this essentially is, it has the same characteristics of issuing equity to an investor. So it still represents equity, it still represents dilution, but you're promising this equity and these characteristics once you have converted the agreement into equity. So you've converted the shares to equity for the investors, then the investors will have kind of similar to how option pools work, where you give your employees a specific percentage of equity on a specific schedule. But this is, instead of a schedule there, you'll just have to wait until you raise your equity round, then that will be issued to the investor. They realized that with the SAFE agreements, they raised a lot more capital, a lot more startups started to grow and capitalize on the market, and overall worked as a good alternative to a convertible note. So I just wanted to raise these points on why YC is kind of important in their role in fundraising in on a global scale, not only on a regional scale.
Yeah, thank you for that context. And it does highlight some of the evolution that happens or has happened in the United States, and I think will be very interesting to watch in Iraq as we go from sort of this straight equity investment to perhaps more complicated ways of doing investment. So I'll switch over to
Pat, can I jump in for a second?
Sure.
One other thing I think that comes out of the YC experience, and Yadgar, you can comment, is the network you gain while you're there. And I think you yourselves at Lezzoo have made some strategic business alliances with groups that you met at YC. So that's something that's important. But also I think maybe it might be useful for the audience that's listening, Yadgar, if you could describe what the application process is like.
Sure. So basically, YC has a program known as Startup School program. So Startup School is open for anyone to participate in. You can sign up. It's a 3-week intensive program where you get a series of talks on marketing, growth, product management, launching, investment, fundraising, and all of that.
Do you have to pay for that?
No, it's free to sign up. Yeah, and then after that, you have the actual program to sign up to. And this is where you, out of, let's say, 10, all the applicants, only 0.3% would be accepted for an interview, right? And this is when you get an interview, remote interview by YC. Once you've passed the remote interview, then you may have an in-person, so the stage 3 in-person interview in San Francisco, but that has changed after the pandemic, where you don't need to go to San Francisco anymore. And then finally, within that interview, which is a 10-minute interview, and simply 10-minute interview, within 10 minutes, they will decide whether you're in or you're not. And you have to be prepared. There's also a website called, I think, PG, so Paul Graham questions, and there's a timer, 30 seconds. You get different questions that Paul Graham asks, and then you practice. If you go to the YC program, you can practice with those questions. They're really good questions, and I really do recommend anyone who's currently working on a startup or has a product to manage, please go through that. It's really, really important for you to know more about your product. That was the final stage. And in that final stage, I think only like 0.03% of the entire batch will be accepted as their new batch. So that was us on the final stage of being accepted in YC, which is a very, very small number of applicants out of the entire batch that usually applies every year.
I didn't know that about the questions. That's really interesting, and the 10 minutes. So that's a high pressure pitch.
Before COVID, they expected people to fly to San Francisco for a 10-minute interview.
Yep, and then then they had after that they had an office established in India because they have a huge the second largest cohort is India, yeah, in NYC. So they realized that due to the logistical difficulties, then you can either get interviewed in India, or you get interviewed in San Francisco. That was still before the pandemic. But once the pandemic happened, now everything is remote. The entire process is remote. Even demo day is remote. Yeah.
Is YC back in terms of having cohorts come to San Francisco for the training course? Is that back on now?
Even that is remote now. So
that's remote. Okay.
We were fortunate enough to have that experience. We were the last cohort before the pandemic started. So
wow.
Yeah, after us, then that style changed. Everything is remote.
But in a way, for Iraqi applicants, that that may solve one big problem, which is a visa issue for the United States. And it's not easy for Iraqis to get a visa for the US. I don't know if YC helps in any way. They may give you a letter or something to say that you're.
They do provide you with a letter. However, during the Trump's administration, it was even that could not exempt you from the restrictions that Trump's administration had over, Iraq. And if you had, remember the list that he had where these anyone from these countries are not allowed to enter the US. So that did cause a lot of difficulties for us, actually. Thanks for reminding me on this point that the three co-founders were meant to be in the US, and all three were meant to be fundraising together. So due to these difficulties, we could not all go to the US. So I still remember at one point during the demo day where I got out and we had like, 60, 70 likes by investors. And I just didn't know who to turn to. The time zone difference, I couldn't keep the other co-founders awake because it was late in Kurdistan and in Iraq. So it was somewhat of a difficult process, but it worked out eventually.
So Zaab, I'm curious how you got involved with Lezzoo. This is, as you mentioned, one of your first investments for Northern Gulf Partners, or with Northern Gulf Partners, and I know that you have other people that you brought into the investment. So I'm wondering if you could talk about your initial reaction and introduction to Lezzoo, but also sort of how you think about moving forward and investing in Iraq.
Yes, sure. So just to be clear, it's one of our first investments in the tech space.
Sorry, yes.
But we've done plenty of other investments in Iraq in real estate, in financial services, in energy services and things like that. It's also actually our first investment in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, where the rest of our work has always been focused on the center and the south. But to answer your question, Pat, how we came across Lezzoo actually through a group that introduced them to us. And I think, in fact, it was you who introduced Lezzoo to that group. So so it's all really down to you, Pat. Thank you. But let me back up by saying we had been looking at the nascent and then burgeoning Iraqi tech space for a couple of years, and I'd seen this going on around me. Pre-COVID, I was spending a lot of time in Iraq, and now that COVID's receding, I'll be back to going back to Iraq every single month, and I could see that the tech space was developing, and I started to meet founders and entrepreneurs and visit a couple of the very early incubators a couple of years ago, looking at the Iraqi tech space with an idea towards finding some interesting startups that would maybe make a decent investment. And I was having trouble finding something that really fit our investment criteria until I met Lezzoo. And let me say that the Y Combinator experience that they had and the background that they gained in YC was a great help, but it wasn't really the defining issue. I mean, I think we probably would have invested in Lezzoo anyway without that YC background, because I think the founders are very high quality, very thoughtful, and have really put a lot of work into this idea, into the company, and into building it out. But having the YC background made it a much easier decision on our part. And then what we did is we built a little syndicate, or a little investors club. So we brought in a few other investors to join us. And I have to say, when discussing with other investors, when you explain that this is a group that's been through YC, it immediately becomes an easier conversation, because these were investors mainly in North America or in Europe. And so that's why I would encourage Iraqis that are listening to this conversation, that are maybe founders themselves or thinking about it, to to look at applying to a course like that. It doesn't have to be YC. There are others in the market, and you can do a bit of research and see that there are others. But the fact that it's now available online does make things a lot easier in terms of the logistics, as Yadgar was saying, with the visas and permissions and the travel and all of that. So I would definitely encourage Iraqi founders to look at some kind of training program like that. And I can see what the YC training did for Lezzoo in terms of the professionalism of the way the company is set up, their internal processes, even things like their human resources programs and policies, and their knowledge of finance and marketing, and basically how to run an early stage tech company. Not to mention all the structural advice that Yadgar touched on that YC helped them with. So establishing a company, getting a bank account, getting a well-regarded law firm to draw up your documents. All those things make it easier for an international investor to invest into an Iraqi company, because of course, from an international investment standpoint, Iraq is still very much a frontier market, and investors want to see as much as possible some kind of protections for their investment. So whether that is being able to invest in an offshore company, a company outside Iraq, which in turn owns the company inside Iraq, looking at whether the company has lawyers, auditors, a bank account with a bank of that with a well-known bank, or a bank that is creditworthy. So those are all very useful things that we saw in Lezzoo coming out of the Y Combinator experience.
That's interesting. Zaab, I'm going to stay with you, and then we'll ask the same question to Yadgar in a second. But I think a lot of people who are curious about investment and currently searching for investment wonder a little bit about the relationship, what happens when I get an investor. So I'm wondering if each of you could talk about, once again, we'll start with Zaab, sort of how your relationship works. How often do you work together? What role do you play, Zaab, in the functioning of Lezzoo? And then Yadgar, when we turn around to you, we'll talk about how you like to interact with your investors.
Well, let me say, first of all, our primary criteria for investment is the people. So we're investing in people with a good idea, with competence, but we're investing in the people, and that's the most important thing. So we must have a relationship of trust, and nowadays with the pandemic, it's been difficult to have face-to-face meetings, but we were able to have a couple of face-to-face meetings. I think 3 face-to-face meetings with Yadgar, 2 in Iraq and 1 in London before we made the investment. Whenever we invest in Iraq as a group, Northern Gulf Partners, we always do our due diligence. So in all markets, from all investment standpoints, information is very important. So so we have to make sure that that there are no red flags associated with the people involved, or that everything checks out. So we do that. And then in terms of the ongoing relationship, an investor and a founder have to have a regular channel of communications, and we kind of built it into our investment agreement, or into our initial agreements with Lezzoo, that we would have regular communications, just so that we had it memorialized on paper, that we would have an open book. In fact, we didn't need to do that, because we have a very close communications relationship with the founders of Lezzoo, and we're in touch all the time, and they give us very comprehensive monthly and quarterly reports on the company, and that's something that's necessary. So again, for the founders and potential founders out there, you have to be open to communicate with your investors. You have to plan on giving regular reports, and you actually have to spend time producing those reports. And that's something that I can see that the founders of Lezzoo do. They don't just jump on a call and give us a few bullet points. You can see they've actually spent a substantial quantity of time putting together a report, pulling together the numbers, and and they have a kind of agenda set of what they want to talk about. So those kind of things in terms of the communications are very important. And then in terms of our role as investors with Lezzoo, it's very minimal because they're doing a great job, and they're the ones who run the company. But we're always, the phone is always ready to be answered whenever they need anything, any advice, and if we can help in any way, we try to.
Great, thanks. Yadgar, your impression or your view on that relationship?
I mean, most of what Zaab just stated is very accurate. And just to add on to that would be, an investor is giving you that the means to achieve that idea, and at the same time, the investor will be there. And at the end of the day, investors have a different understanding and experience of the markets than a founder. A founder comes in the market hot-blooded, just wants to go forward and do everything, and says, no, I know, we know what we exactly want to do. But you should never underestimate what investors know. Investors have seen patterns of markets changing throughout history. And Zaab and Zaab's group happen to have a really unique value here, is that not only they have experience in seeing the patterns changing throughout the global market, but also seeing the dynamics of the Iraqi market as well, seeing from one administration changing to another administration, the ups and downs of the economy, and other factors being the let's say enhancing or sort of slowing down the Iraqi market. They have a good understanding of how that operates. So for us, is we don't just go forward. We know that there are points in Lezzoo that it would be difficult to translate to an investor on why exactly we decided to take this point, not that point. Though at the same time, we still understand the importance of reporting this information to your investor, making sure that a line of communication is always available, be as transparent as possible. So when you have positive achievements, make sure that if you have negative, let's say, factors coming into the startup, be as transparent with the investors. Do not fall into this trap of thinking like, okay, we'll just make sure that only good news is reported. No, make sure that you also get good news and bad news. It's a very normal pattern. You don't expect your startup to be always positive. Like the greatest startups in the world, I mean, you just saw, let's use Deliveroo as an example. Deliveroo being one of the leading delivery services in the world, mainly based in London, recently got listed on the London Stock Exchange, and the stock plummeted by, I think, 25% to 30%. I mean, that's like £2.5 billion just going off of your value. I was just thinking that, imagine your startup or your venture just has like, 20 or 30% of its value just goes away. It is what it is. At the same time, as you're seeing that a lot of the investors today are not looking at what's happening today, they're looking at what will happen to the sector in 2025 or in 2030, given in how rapidly the delivery market is growing and how rapidly the marketplace landscape is growing. So this is why being transparent is really important. As it is, of course, investor from investor is different. We've had investors that, they've told us that, okay, sure, you've grown 120% year over year, all good and all great, but don't you think you can be a little faster in whatever you do, which isn't accurate. It's at the end of the day, it's you have to listen and you have to make sure that these points are taken into consideration. We did take it into consideration as just to give to further clarify the context. These points matter, and you should be a good listener. At the end of the day, your investor would be the closest, one of the closest, apart from your co-founders and your team, to understand your pain points and understand what you're going through. And make sure that as you grow and as your product succeeds, maintain the same kind of character with your investors as you will with your partners and your team members. Just because your product is succeeding does not mean that you should now say, well, I have a lot of options in front of me. I'm not obliged to be the same modest character as I was in my previous in my history. So all these points are very important to incorporate together, because this is not a 1 year or 6 months relationship, right? Depending on how in a rush you are to exit, to have an immediate exit. If you need an immediate exit, then that's a different way of looking at your product. But in our case, in Lezzoo's case, we're really building a digital infrastructure in Iraq, and we are so bullish on the Iraqi market, and we are so optimistic on where we want to be. So it only makes sense that you have a long way ahead of you, and I'm sure, Zaab, we have many years hopefully coming ahead of us as we continue building Lezzoo. So I would advise everyone else that when you work on a product and you have an investor on board, just make sure that you remember this is a long journey, and stay as you are, and yeah, and see where it goes.
That's great advice. I will highlight the transparency. I talk about this often, to bring the two answers together very briefly. Zaab talking about trust and Yadgar talking about transparency. They go together, and you have to be honest. You can't hide this type of stuff forever. People will find out, and once the trust is broken, it makes investment basically impossible. So I think that's a really good point to highlight. Yeah. Very briefly, because we have a few good questions I promised people we would get to. Both of you mentioned the future in one way or another. I'll start with Zaab. Maybe talk a little bit about what you think you're interested in coming up in terms of investment, whether that be different sectors or probably not individual companies, but sort of what you think the trends are, what you're watching, and what you're excited about in investment in Iraq. And then Yadgar, when we turn to you, we'll talk about your next steps with investment and what you're looking for in a new race.
So one point I'd like to make in terms of discussions with investors, and this is an issue we've come across in all different sectors, not necessarily in tech, but in with all sectors that we have looked at investing in Iraq. You have an Iraqi business person or entrepreneur or somebody with an established business who is looking ahead at the great growth prospects that exist in Iraq, which we will all agree that are there. It's a country of 40 million people, has potential to become a middle-income country very quickly. Every sector needs everything. So Iraqi entrepreneurs are always looking ahead, and they value their company based on the future prospects. And then an investor comes and they value the company using different metrics, of course, track record and existing market share, comparables, etc., whatever it is. And so sometimes we have actually found it impossible. We've been interested in investing in an Iraqi business, but we found it impossible to bring those two sides together because the Iraqi entrepreneur's valuation is so far ahead of where an investor could get to, realistically speaking, that I've seen potential deals fail in Iraq. So that's something to be aware of. That both sides need to have an air of what's realistic. In terms of what we're looking at, great question. So one of the things that we see in Iraq is the financial services sector is so undeveloped, and anybody who's had any experience dealing with Iraqi banks knows what I mean. And in fact, the great majority of the population don't, according to surveys, including market research that Lezzoo has done, the great majority of the population actually don't even take part in the banking system. So this is an area where digital technology can really disrupt existing markets. And we've seen that around the world, in Africa, in East Asia, where technology can actually take the place of existing institutions and offer people the services that they need. And so for me, that was one of the um, great attractions to Lezzoo. And what we haven't talked about really is the idea of the super app. And I was, a little bit aware of the super apps that have grown up in Asia, but it wasn't really until talking to Yadgar and the Lezzoo founders in the early stages when we were researching the company that I saw the great potential for a super app in Iraq. And a super app meaning an application that that can provide a number of services to the user all through the same app. So it's deliveries and potentially e-commerce, but also a digital wallet providing all sorts of financial services. And two fantastic examples of super apps that people should look at are Grab and Gojek, which both grew up in Southeast Asia. I think one in Singapore and one in Indonesia, if that's correct, Yadgar. And these are now multi-billion-dollar companies. I think one of them's about to go public on the New York Stock Exchange for $39 billion. But they started off one as a delivery company and one as a ride-hailing company. But they grew the number of verticals in terms of the services they offer to people, and they continued to grab market share while centralizing it through their own app. And the most important aspect of what these companies do, to my mind, is the financial services that they offer. So Lezzoo has already started that with its Lezzoo Pay function, but it's still the early days and they need to build it out. But if you look at some of these other apps in other markets, they started first with a small e-wallet. But as they provide services both to the users and to the merchants who are selling goods to the users, they start collecting data on the businesses and the consumers. And they can then start using that data to provide financial services like savings, like loans, like insurance, and down the line. And that's something that I'm looking at very closely in Iraq, and I think there's a tremendous opportunity in Iraq. There are a number of regulatory hurdles, but actually, I don't think that there are huge blockages. I think the central bank is a good institution, and they do have rules in place, and you can work with the central bank. So I think that's something that we're looking at very closely.
Great, thank you. And yeah, your sort of future fundraise, what you see as the landscape developing in Iraq.
So it's, again, as Zaab mentioned, that Iraq is still a frontier market, you can say. There's a lot of untapped fields in that still has a lot of potential to be accumulated. Though with our from our side as Lezzoo, we're not only trying to position ourselves in the competitive landscape in Iraq, we're also trying to position ourselves in the competitive landscape of Middle East. Because we think that the Middle East itself, there's a lot more room for growth. Yes, it has been growing a lot. It's been growing rapidly. There's a lot of investment coming to Middle East, but we still haven't witnessed on, for example, what happened in India. If you look at the investment landscape, foreign direct investment of only startups in India throughout the past 10 years until now, you'll see that it has grown on an exponential level. We're expecting the same thing for the Middle East as a whole, though Iraq is our market where we started from, similar to where Kareem started from the UAE. You have Fodi started from Egypt. You had Talabat started from Kuwait, and you have different products which started in different regions and then expanded throughout the Middle East. So we're positioning ourselves on the competitive landscape of not Iraq only, the Middle East as well, because looking at super apps, as Zaab mentioned, are the next, which we believe is the next trend of marketplaces. Today, you look at marketplaces that you see either whether being a fintech, even fintech have their own super apps now. When you look at, let's say, fintech solutions such as Monzo, that has gone as far as giving you corporate cards, giving you loans, microloans, or giving you specific like pay in advance, a credit, and then giving you, let's say, loans for your employees and all these different services. You're seeing that that's a fintech super app in one way or another. Or like Lyft, for example, in the US, you're seeing that they're not only doing ride hailing, but they're doing multiple services that have to do with ride hailing. So essentially, it's a ride hailing super app. So super app is basically having multiple services in one single app, but the way you start these services is it may sound nice theoretically to have everything as in one single app, but in practice it's quite complicated because each product is treated differently and each product has its different traction. But all of that technical and product management to the side, in terms of our fundraising, we are now, and Zaab is aware of as well, that we are raising for our equity round, for our Series A round. And we will be disclosing once the round has been closed. And once it does, this time we are going to announce it, of how much we have raised for our Series A round. And with this, given that we with the seed round, we can say that we achieved a product market fit in the Kurdistan region, mainly in Erbil. And we measure product market fit based on our traction and our retention and churn. And retention is basically how many customers have you retained within a certain time frame, and churn is the opposite of retention. Just to clarify for the audience, of how many customers you have left your product. But based on the criteria of what is product market fit, we can say that we have almost achieved that in the Kurdistan region, mainly in Erbil. Now we have to go to Baghdad. As you know, we've launched in Baghdad last week, and we're in our soft launch at the moment. We want to replicate our experience and insight in the Kurdistan region, in the center of Iraq and south of Iraq. Based on that, we'll see how well we achieve our numbers. We managed to, as mentioned before, increase our revenue by almost 150% after the seed round. Now we have another milestone to make sure that that growth is then again, our target is achieved after the Series A round. With that, then we can see of how well we are positioned to then think about beyond Iraq. We did make history by being the first Iraqi Kurdish startup to participate in Y Combinator. We did make history to raise the largest seed round in Iraq. We also want to be one of the first few, if not the first, Iraqi tech startup to be launching and going beyond the Iraqi borders. So those are our ambitions, and this is our vision, and we'll see where we will be in the coming 2 years, and we'll see if we can have a talk then in the future, hopefully, of how that experience was.
Yeah, of course. You know, we've been involved for a number of years already, so we'll be in touch, of course. We only have a few minutes, but I'd love to get your thoughts on a couple quick audience questions. Please let me know if you have to go. Have been quite a few questions about getting in touch, and you can see that Zaab responded in the Q&A as his email is info@northerngp.com. So you can find more information and get in touch with him. I just wanted to highlight that. Yadgar can respond as well, I think, in the chat. The one question that I'd like to talk about comes about from this first question we have in the Q&A about banks providing loans, and what you think is sort of the best, what we can broaden that to sort of what you think of maybe the best way to go about investment. How do you feel about loans as a form of investment, not only in Iraq, but just in general? I will be transparent in saying that generally speaking, I don't think it's a great idea. It's not a good concept for growing businesses to have to pay back their money. But I'd love to hear what Zaab and Yadgar think briefly about loans as investment.
Well, if you allow me, I think there's it's always worth looking at the possibility of a loan, because of course, when you take investment as equity in your company, that means that your share of the company is declining. So looking at debt finance is one way to prevent your dilution of your share in the company. And it has its place when it can be useful. But in the Iraqi market, I think it's very difficult to raise any debt finance from Iraqi banks. Iraqi banks are not really lending at all. They're making money from doing wire transfers and issuing letters of credit and doing foreign exchange trading. And they're not really in the business of lending. And when they are, they want to see over 100% of the value of the loan in collateral. So most commonly it's land in Iraq or gold or some other kind of security. So it's not a particularly useful way for founders in Iraq to raise capital. I don't know if Yadgar has any different experience.
I think I would agree with Pat on this point that generally in Iraq, we still believe that there is enough, there's in fact a lot of room available for ideas to come to life where an investor can understand where the prospect of, or the value proposition of this essential problem is that you're solving. And a loan, you can get it, there can be an alternative to a loan. There is, I mean, just as Zaab mentioned, in terms of financial services in Iraq, fintech is one of the, let's say, most popular categories of fields of startups at the moment in the VC world. I mean, as one of the top 3, I would say. And Iraq has a banking penetration of 11% or 12%, I think. So there's still 88% of people are unbanked in Iraq. That gives you so much room to, for example, start any kind of financial service. I mean, don't forget that a fintech solution is not only having a wallet where you can store your money on. That's just one of the services in the financial solutions that you can provide. There's plenty more solutions that Iraq needs today. And same with the Kurdistan region. Kurdistan's banking infrastructure is as weak, if not weaker at times compared to the Iraqi banking infrastructure, simply because most of the banking is centralized by the Central Bank of Iraq. So they always have more leverage over the Kurdistan region in terms of how things are operated. So that's one side. And the overall supply chain and logistics, I think there's still a lot of issues in supply chain and logistics in Iraq, going from like warehousing to last mile to city transportation and all of that. So there's a lot that can be done. And with the traction that you have, I mean, Zaab may agree with me, if you have promising traction and you have a good vision and or prospect for the solution that you have for the problem, you should be getting some investment as a pre-seed or a small amount of capital before you start your startup. Maybe that's us as the new generation of Lezzoo who are optimistic in that sense. Maybe that's not the case for everyone, but we truly believe that there's enough room for great solutions to start in Iraq.
I think that's right, Yadgar. And I saw a question, I think, from somebody in the audience saying, is it necessary for the founders to invest at all, or can they just go with a business plan to investors? I think I don't have the questions in front of me, but I think somebody asked a question, if I understand it correctly, and I think that it actually it is necessary for the founders to show that they've put something in to getting the business up and running, and generally in Iraq, people can find some small, low level of investment through their own networks. And then they can approach investors that they don't know, whether inside Iraq or outside Iraq. But they'll be in a much stronger position when they do that, rather than just coming with a business plan and an idea on a piece of paper.
That's great. That was actually where I was going to leave, Zaab, was your opinion on sort of what stage you would get involved in. And I will ask you that probably more directly here just in our last minute. The question, as I interpreted it, was also not only about that person investing in the business, but sort of like not actually having traction. So it's an idea. Can I take an idea out to an investor and get funding basically just for the idea and not yet having customers? And so I will, since we're over time, I will actually end on this question to you, Zaab, which is to make it slightly bigger, which is, do you consider just ideas, in air quotes, and then maybe more specifically, if you don't, sort of what stage you and Northern Gulf Partners like to get involved in businesses?
Sure. And I mean, the answer to the question is it depends, which is not a very useful answer. But
all the great answers are it depends.
It depends, number one, on the founder. So if the person with the idea, the entrepreneur, the founder, has experience, especially in another tech business, and they've seen a space in the market, they've already had some years of experience working in another company, and they've seen some kind of niche where they think they could fill it, then that may be something that we could invest in purely on an idea basis, because somebody's what they're bringing to the table is some experience and some knowledge of the market and some some kind of vision as to filling an unmet need. So I just saw an article in the Financial Times yesterday that a couple of executives came out of one of the large delivery firms in Europe with the idea to do immediate grocery deliveries. And all they had was an idea. But because of their background in working in a company that was doing delivery of cooked food, restaurant food, investors had confidence in their idea and their ability to execute. So from an investment standpoint, you want confidence in the people, in the idea itself, and in the people's ability to actually make that idea come to life. And so I saw that these executives who came out of another business had nothing except an idea on a piece of paper, immediately raised $30 million. So that shows you. So really, it depends who is doing the idea, who has come up with the idea, what their background is, what their experience is. It's harder for us to invest with someone who is brand new to the space, doesn't have work experience in this space, maybe has work experience in something else, but has come up with a good idea, but we just can't be confident of that person's ability to execute.
Great. So then you think more about being involved with businesses that if there is not that proof of experience, then you're looking for demonstrated traction across customer problem solving.
Exactly, but it can be at a very low level. I'm not saying you need to plow in hundreds of thousands of dollars into the business, but you need to have actually taken the first few steps of setting it up and trying to run it and seeing and being able to prove if there is traction, as you say.
Great. Thank you both. I will say that we did not get to all of the questions here in the chat. A few of them are, I think, directly related to Lezzoo's business. And Yadgar, I know you want to say something else. I will just say Yadgar provided his email in the chat, yadgar@lezzoo.com. I will turn over to you for 1 second, Yadgar, and then we'll close out.
Yeah, I just realized, I mean, you would not expect this from me, but I'm not too familiar with Zoom because I use Google Meet a lot more than Zoom. So I just saw the questions now, but I just, please email me. I'm more than happy to arrange a call with you. Those of you have asked me the questions, and I'm more than happy to go through whatever's needed. That's all I wanted to share.
Yeah, that's helpful. I would say I don't want to volunteer your time, but first-hand experience with Yadgar is that he is incredibly helpful and supportive of other entrepreneurs. He's done a lot of work with 51 Labs in supporting entrepreneurs who are at an earlier stage. It's one of the things we really enjoy about him and working with him. And so I would say those specific questions should go directly to him. I don't know if you're going to give all of your growth secrets, Yadgar, but I know that you'll do the best to help that you can. I want to thank both of you for your time. For those audience members, I will say that this will be up on our YouTube channel probably tomorrow, and I encourage you to send that out to your channels and networks. I think there was a lot of great information here shared today. I think you have the contact information of both of these gentlemen, and I look forward to working with both of you in the future, and I'm excited about the way this is developing in Iraq. Good luck with the new raise, Yadgar, and then Zaab. We have been in contact, and I'm excited to see sort of what Northern Gulf Partners does here in the future.
Thank you, Pat, and thanks to 51 Labs for organizing it. Thanks to all the audience for attending.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you everyone. And thanks Pat, Patricia, and Banu for all of you and for everyone attending. And good to see you, Zaab.
See you.
Appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
All right. Okay, bye-bye.